They called her the Black Widow of Georgia, the woman who turned the noose against the men who tied it. By the end of this story, you'll know why 11 Klansmen vanished in one summer, and why the 12th man left behind a letter written in his own blood. The first time anyone remembered seeing her, the sun was sinking behind the Georgia pines, throwing a copper haze across the tracks. The train from Savannah screeched to a halt, its iron lungs exhaling steam that smelled like soot and rain. Out of the cloud stepped a woman dressed head to toe in black. Her veil fluttered just enough to show a sliver of pale skin, and for a moment the few men loitering by the station forgot to spit their tobacco. She carried only a small leather satchel, a Bible pressed to her chest, and a revolver hidden in her skirt, lining that no one saw until it was far too late. She didn't look lost. She looked deliberate, as though she had already memorized the town before she ever set foot in it. Americus, Georgia, in 1872, was a place where the war had ended only on paper. The men who had lost their cause still wore their pride like armor, and by night, white hoods rode through the pine woods, their laughter tangled with the cries of the hunted. The freedmen had learned to keep their lamps dark, and every child was taught that silence could mean survival. Into that silence the woman in black arrived. The locals whispered that she was a widow who had come south to find her husband's grave. Some said she had kin in Albany, others said she had none at all. No one asked too many questions, because in those years, grief was so common that it looked ordinary. When she spoke, her voice carried a northern edge that made the townsfolk uneasy. It was calm, measured, and too proper for the muddy drawl of the South. She rented a small room above the apothecary, paid 2 months in advance, and spent her evenings writing by lamplight. The old woman who owned the shop below claimed she never heard her weep. She would only hum quietly while she sewed, a tune no one could name, but that sounded faintly like a funeral hymn. The men in town noticed her immediately. Not for beauty in the usual sense, but because she looked like something carved out of determination. They said her eyes could cut through smoke, that they didn't blink long enough to belong to the living. The first to approach her was a man named Silas Boone, a plantation overseer turned Klan captain, proud of the scars he wore like medals. He met her at the Sunday market when she was buying bread, tipping his hat in that lazy way Southern men used when they thought they were charming. She smiled back politely and asked where a widow might find safe lodging for the winter. Boone offered to look after her affairs. The next night she accepted his invitation to dinner. By dawn, Boone's horse was still tied outside the barn. When the stable boy went to check on him, he found Boone hanging from a beam, eyes wide, throat open, blood dried to a crust that drew flies in perfect circles. The sheriff called it suicide. There were no signs of struggle. No footprints except Boone's. The woman left town that evening without a word. Some claimed they saw her walking north along the river, her black skirts brushing the reeds. The next town she passed through, Cordele, lost another man within a week, another Klan officer whose lungs had filled with swamp water, though there was no sign of a struggle. That was when the whispers began. They called her the Black Widow, the curse in a mourning dress, the storm that followed bad men. The air in those parts was heavy with superstition, but even the skeptics began to count the coincidences. Every town she visited, every name she spoke, seemed to vanish soon after. The papers didn't print the deaths, of course. The Klan made sure of that, but rumors travel faster than ink. Farmers spoke of a pale woman seen at dusk near the crossroads. Children told stories of her walking along the churchyard fence, placing small white flowers on unmarked graves. Some said she was an angel of vengeance. Others swore she was a ghost, the restless wife of a man lynched unjustly. What no one saw was the small book she kept hidden in the lining of her Bible. Names, dates, initials, each written with a soldier's precision. The first page bore 2 words, Jonathan Harper, her husband. The man the Klan dragged from his bed 3 years earlier for hiding 3 freedmen in their barn. They burned the barn, hanged him from the oak by the river, and left her with the ashes. The town had offered no justice. The sheriff himself had looked away. That night she vanished, and now she had returned with a list. She never stayed anywhere long enough to leave a scent. To the preacher she was a grieving soul seeking redemption. To the midwife, a lady passing through. To the barkeep, a quiet woman with a sharp tongue for drunks. The truth was she studied them all, how they walked, how they spoke, how they lied. She listened in silence at the back of church meetings, where men whispered about their nightly rides. She memorized their voices. She could recognize a Klansman by the sound of his boots long before he spoke. And one by one, she followed them home. There was no pattern to her methods. One man found dead with a crushed glass of whiskey in his hand, another drowned in his own horse trough, another discovered with his lips stained by the same red lipstick she wore. But always there was the same signature, a single black thread placed on the body, thin as a spider's silk. Some thought it was a warning, others a promise. By late summer, fear had begun to spread among the Klan's ranks. They started riding in pairs, then in groups, convinced a rival faction was hunting them. The idea of a lone woman never crossed their minds. In their world, a woman was a comfort, not a consequence. But Evelyn Harper, though no one had yet linked that name to the killings, knew exactly how to weaponize their arrogance. She smiled when they stared. She listened when they boasted. She poured the whiskey, and when they reached for her hand, she let them feel safe just long enough to forget that she was the one holding the knife. Her movements were so calculated that even the law couldn't find her shadow. Deputies followed rumors, rode through towns where she'd already passed, questioned innkeepers who remembered only a lady who paid in gold and never left a mess. The few who might have suspected her were either too afraid or too enchanted to speak. There was a power in her silence, a discipline that made her seem untouchable. One night, an elderly preacher claimed to see her kneeling by the riverbank where the lynching tree still stood. He said she was whispering names into the water, one by one, as if returning them to God. When he called out to her, she looked over her shoulder and smiled. He said her face was streaked with rain, but her eyes were dry. Then she walked into the mist, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of lilac and smoke. By the time the third man died, the sheriff of Sumter County began to take notice. He rode to each town, collecting statements that made less sense the more he read them. A woman traveling alone, a widow, always polite, always gone before the bodies were cold, and always the same quiet detail that no one thought mattered, the black thread. It wasn't rope fiber or clothing lint. It was silk, the kind used in sewing Union uniforms during the war. That was the moment curiosity became dread. The sheriff didn't yet know her name. He only knew that whatever ghost haunted the Klan's men was made of flesh and calculation, not faith or luck. And somewhere out there in the long stretch of pine and shadow, the woman in black was already choosing her next town. Her next name to cross off the list. The wind carried her story like a sermon no one dared to finish because everyone feared they might be written into it next. When the second body appeared, even the bravest men in America stopped leaving their lamps burning at night. The Klan was used to being feared, not hunted. They rode with confidence, cloaked in righteousness and bourbon, believing that darkness belonged to them. But something was moving within that darkness now, something colder, quieter, more patient. They began to suspect each other. The whispers grew poisonous. Maybe one of their own had turned traitor. Maybe a freedman had learned the art of killing. No one dared to speak of the widow in black, though more than one man had seen her silhouette standing near the cemetery fence, unmoving, like a carving left by the night itself. The killings came like clockwork. Every few weeks, another leader gone. The first had been messy, but by the third, it was surgical. No signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing stolen. Just bodies that looked almost peaceful, except for their eyes. Wide, glassy, the last thing they had seen burned into the retinas. The coroner in Macon, a man too clever for his own safety, noted something strange. Traces of a clear liquid under the victim's fingernails and lips. He suspected belladonna, a poison that killed slowly, paralyzing muscles before shutting down the lungs. It left no odor, no color. You could sip it from a glass of wine and smile while dying. The report never reached the sheriff's office. It disappeared from the courthouse archives a day after it was written. In taverns and back rooms, the Klan began to argue. They accused outsiders, rival factions, even ex-Confederate soldiers who had turned mercenary. Meetings ended in gunfire more than once. The same men who once dictated fear now found themselves living inside it. They started riding in larger numbers, their torches burning brighter, as if the fire could ward off whatever hunted them. But the brighter the flame, the clearer their faces were in the dark, and the easier it was for her to follow. She didn't rush. That was what set her apart from revenge-driven men. Evelyn Harper knew that vengeance wasn't about rage. It was about rhythm. She watched them like a strategist, not an avenger. She studied the patterns of their nights, where they met. Which ones lingered too long at taverns? Which ones rode home alone? Her patience was terrifying. She could spend days pretending to be a grieving guest at a wake, quietly observing the men who claimed to serve justice. Sometimes she would speak to them, softly, as if seeking protection. They would lean close, breathing in her perfume, believing they were the hunter. She always left first, and they always died next. The Klan's inner circle began sending coded letters to each other. The letters were frantic, scrawled, half-blotted by sweat. They spoke of a curse wearing a woman's face, of a northern witch who could make a man confess before she killed him. A few even suggested the devil himself had sent her as retribution for broken oaths. But the ones who spoke too loudly didn't live long enough to repeat the story. One was found at the edge of his field, hanging from the same kind of noose he had once tied. Another drowned in his own well. The bodies told no tales, but the pattern spoke louder than any sermon. There was one witness, a stable hand named Isaiah. He was a freedman, and he knew better than to talk to Whitelaw, but he confided in the preacher after Sunday service, voice trembling as he described what he saw. He said a woman had come to the stables late one night, asking for a horse. She wore black gloves and a veil, but her voice was soft, the kind of voice that made men lower their rifles. He helped her saddle the mare. Before she left, she pressed a silver coin into his palm and whispered, "You'll never see me twice." A week later, his employer, a local Klan recruiter, was found with a slit throat. Isaiah left town that night and never came back. The air grew tense. The nights became unnaturally quiet, as if even the frogs were afraid to croak. Men who once mocked death now jumped at shadows. Their wives began noticing their habits changing. Doors bolted, candles burned through the night, guns kept beside the bed. The Klan had built its empire on fear, but they had never tasted it until now. Evelyn's legend spread like the plague. In some towns she was a ghost, in others a fallen angel. Children dared each other to whisper her name at the riverbank, where the moonlight hit the hanging tree. Some claimed she could vanish into mist, others that she traveled by train, changing her name in every town. The truth was simpler. She had learned the art of disguise. In Albany she was Mrs. Everly Hart, a war widow teaching piano. In Columbus she was Miss Evans, a governess. She could mimic accents, forge letters of recommendation, quote the Bible like a preacher's wife. To every man she met, she was what he wanted her to be, until he became what she needed him to be. Gone. Her beauty was not the fragile kind. It was structured from stillness. When she entered a room, conversation faltered, not because of her looks, but because she carried a quiet that demanded respect. She didn't need to smile often. Her silence filled the gaps words couldn't reach. There was a rumor she carried a locket with her husband's ashes, but when one man reached to see it, she told him gently, "The last man who touched this burned for it." He laughed, until he didn't. He was found days later, face pale, eyes glassy, a small black thread resting on his chest. By autumn, the killings had become so consistent that even the newspapers could no longer ignore them. The Atlanta Journal ran a discreet column calling it "The Widow's Trail." The editor disappeared 3 days later on his way to Columbus. His carriage was found overturned, the horses gone, the seat soaked in blood. After that, no one wrote about her again. For those who lived through that season, time began to feel circular. Each funeral echoed the last. Each prayer felt hollow. Even the Klan's rituals lost their fervor. The men's confidence had curdled into paranoia. Some fled the state entirely, vanishing north with their families, while others stayed behind, too proud to admit fear. They told themselves the killings would stop when they repented. But repentance was never what she wanted. She wanted precision. The few who survived long enough to piece things together began noticing a pattern. The deaths aligned with the names of the 11 men who had led the lynching party that killed Jonathan Harper in 1869. It wasn't random. It was arithmetic, an equation of loss balanced through death. One man for every life he'd tried to destroy. But they didn't know her name yet. They called her the Weaver because of the black thread. A name born of myth. It made her sound less human. Safer to imagine her as a curse than as a woman capable of such intelligence. Meanwhile, Evelyn kept meticulous notes. She never struck impulsively. She gathered information, calculated doses, studied anatomy. The Union spy network she'd once brushed against during the war had taught her more than she admitted: how to observe, how to vanish, how to kill without noise. She wasn't just hunting the men who murdered her husband. She was dismantling an entire system built on their cruelty, one life at a time. Each act was a sermon, and her scripture was vengeance. One night, when the moon was high and the fog rolled low over the fields, a posse of Klansmen decided to hunt her. 10 men on horseback, torches in hand, their white hoods glowing like phantoms. They combed the woods near the river, calling her name as if daring her to answer. By dawn, only 4 returned. The rest were found in the marsh 2 days later, faces bloated, mouths filled with black threads. The survivors never spoke publicly again. Some said they had seen her walking on the water's edge, her black dress spreading behind her like wings. By winter's edge, fear had consumed the hierarchy of the Klan in Georgia. Leaders refused to meet in person. Letters went unanswered, orders dissolved. The secret empire of terror that once controlled entire counties was rotting from the inside, undone by a single woman they refused to believe existed. Evelyn Harper had become more than flesh and vengeance. She was myth now. A story told in whispers, proof that even in the darkest corners of a broken nation, there was something more dangerous than hate. A woman who remembered everything. The discovery came almost by accident. A deputy named Henry Lowe, a young man too new to understand the weight of secrets in a southern town, found something glinting in the mud by the riverbank. The morning light was thin, and mist still clung to the grass like breath. When he bent down, the object slipped from his fingers twice before he held it steady. A ring, gold but dulled with dirt, its engraving faint but legible. The inside read JH+E. At first he thought nothing of it. Trinkets washed up in the river all the time. But that night, curiosity gnawed at him. He wiped the ring clean with his shirt and stared at the letters until the meaning began to take shape. The next morning, he rode to the courthouse in Americus, a place where records were kept in dusty ledgers that smelled of mold and ink. The clerk, a thin man with crooked spectacles, didn't like questions. He turned pages reluctantly, muttering about Yankees and troublemakers. But when Henry mentioned the initials, something flickered in the man's eyes. Recognition, quickly buried. After a long silence, he fetched a box from the shelf labeled 1869 Miscellaneous Deaths. The entries were crude, written in uneven handwriting. Half of them didn't even list causes. Then the clerk stopped on one page, fingers trembling slightly. "Jonathan Harper," he said softly. "Hanged by order of the—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Henry knew what that meant. Jonathan Harper had been a farmer, quiet, educated enough to read scripture and write his name clearly. But the record noted a single offense: sheltering freedmen without permit. No trial, no defense. Just execution by local authority. The local authority, of course, was the same group of men who now rode under white hoods, pretending to serve justice. Henry looked at the second entry, scrawled faintly below. Wife missing. Presumed deceased. There was no body, no burial. Only that phrase, presumed deceased. He left the courthouse uneasy, the ring heavy in his pocket. That night, while the town drank and played cards, he sat alone in the station office, turning the ring in his hand, wondering if he'd just unearthed something that was never meant to be found. A widow's ring, a murdered husband, and 11 men who had all met their ends in the last 6 months. He didn't dare say the words aloud, but he began to suspect that someone was rewriting justice in their own blood. Elsewhere, the woman known to few as Evelyn Harper was watching the river from a distance. The same water that had carried away her husband's last breath now mirrored her reflection. Calm, almost serene. In her pocket, she carried a folded newspaper clipping from 3 years earlier, a small notice about local unrest that mentioned her husband's death in a single line, without name or sorrow. She had carried it for so long that the edges had become soft. The ink had faded, but she didn't need to read it anymore. She knew every word by heart. She wore black not out of mourning, but out of defiance. The world that took him from her would never again see her in color. The first time she'd held that ring, Jonathan had placed it on her finger beneath the willow tree by their farmhouse. He had laughed softly when it got stuck halfway, saying, "It means it was meant for you." When they came for him, she'd hidden the ring under her tongue, tasting metal and fear. Afterward, when the rope creaked and the smoke rose, she'd kept it there still, as though swallowing his promise could keep him alive inside her. That was the part no one knew, how far back her vengeance had begun. It hadn't started with hatred. It started with love, scorched into something sharper. When Henry returned the next day to show the ring to his superior, Sheriff Elias Crow, the man barely glanced at it. Crow had lived through the war, lost brothers, burned his conscience in the same fires that raised Georgia. He had seen more corpses than sermons. "It's just a ring," he said flatly, closing the ledger. But later, when the office was empty, he opened the file again. He remembered the Harper case. Everyone did. The night the Klan came for the man, the entire town had looked away. Jonathan Harper's screams had carried across the river like a sermon no one wanted to hear. The next morning, Crow himself had signed off on the execution report. It was routine. It was order. It was survival. But the sheriff couldn't ignore what had followed since. The sudden deaths, the whispers, the fear that even he now felt when walking home alone. The Klan wasn't supposed to feel hunted, yet here they were, locking doors and muttering prayers. And now this ring, this ghost of a name, was back in his hands. He poured himself a drink and stared at it under the lamplight. The gold gleamed faintly, the engraving catching the flame. JH plus E. He realized the woman's name had never been recorded in the file. Just wife missing, no initials, no photograph. For a moment, he wondered if she was still alive, if she had seen what those men did that night. Then the thought came that chilled him most. What if she hadn't died at all? What if she had learned to wait? Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn was already moving again. She knew her ring was gone. She had dropped it on purpose, a test to see who would find it. The careless kind of bait that only the curious would take. She wanted someone to know, someone in uniform, someone who might dig too deep. Because once they did, she would know where to strike next. Her life had become a map of unfinished vengeance. She had memorized every name, every face, every family that had watched her husband's death like entertainment. Some of the men had tried to move north afterward, seeking distance from their crimes. She found them anyway. One was hiding in a boarding house in Macon working as a clerk. She'd visited as a relative, left a pie at his door. He was found the next morning, face blue, lips foaming. Another was serving as a church deacon in Plains, preaching forgiveness on Sundays. She'd sat in his congregation for 3 weeks before slipping poison into his communion wine. When he collapsed mid-sermon, she walked out without looking back. Each act was precise, never rushed, never random. The black thread she left behind wasn't vanity. It was ritual. She took the thread from her husband's uniform coat, the one piece she had saved from the ashes. Every kill was a stitch, mending something the world had torn apart. By November, the connection between the victims had become too obvious to ignore. Even the Klan elders began whispering about the past. The same men who had laughed while tying ropes now refused to ride at night. Some fled, some armed themselves. A few wrote to Crow, demanding that he end the witch. He assured them he would, though in truth he didn't know where to start. The woman had no description, no trace, only her shadow and the faint perfume of lilac that lingered where death followed. Then came a night when Crow walked alone by the river, half drunk, carrying the ring in his hand. The willow branches hung low, brushing his coat like fingers. Somewhere in the dark, a woman's voice hummed a melody, slow, haunting, familiar. He froze. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere. He called out, but the song stopped. When he looked down, the ring was gone from his palm. Only the warmth of a recent touch remained. He didn't tell anyone about that night. But he stopped wearing his badge for a week, claiming illness. Deep down, he knew that the ring was never a clue to solve. It was a message, a warning sent across years of silence. The woman the world had declared dead was walking again, and she had started where her story had ended, by the river, under the willow, with the ghosts of 11 men waiting their turn. By the winter of 1872, the town of Americus had changed in small but unmistakable ways. Doors that once swung open freely now stayed bolted after dusk. Men who once bragged about their wartime valor now kept pistols beneath their pillows and nightmares behind their eyes. No one said her name aloud, though nearly everyone had heard the stories. The Widow of the River, they called her, a spirit dressed in mourning black, her veil trailing like mist. Some said she could pass through walls. Others swore they had heard her humming just before a man went missing. The truth was worse than the legend, because she wasn't a ghost. She was flesh and blood, and she was still counting names. Sheriff Elias Crow had become a man divided between duty and fear. His office, once the seat of law, now felt like a coffin lined with paper. He stared at the stack of unsolved deaths, all men who had been connected to the old night rides of the Klan. Every report was the same: throat slit in bed, eyes open, or in one case, burned alive in his barn with no sign of forced entry. The pattern was too deliberate, too precise to be coincidence. He tried to convince himself that it was a rival faction, perhaps ex-Confederates turning on each other. But deep down, he remembered the Harper case, the missing wife, and the golden ring that had found its way back into his life. One morning, Crow received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was delicate, almost elegant, written in brown ink that looked faintly like dried blood. The message was short. "You can bury a man, Sheriff, but you cannot bury what he's done." He read it 3 times, then locked it in his drawer. By the end of that week, 2 more men were dead. One was found hanging upside down in his barn, the word mercy carved into the beam above him. The other, a former Klan recruiter, was discovered by the riverbank, throat open, wedding band missing. Crow couldn't ignore the symbolism anymore. Whoever she was, she wanted them to see what they had done to her. Henry Lowe, the young deputy who had found the ring, became Crow's reluctant shadow. He had a conscience that didn't yet know when to look away. He'd grown up hearing stories about justice and redemption, but America's had none left to offer. Henry began tracing the deaths, following the faint lines of connection that led back to that cursed night in 1869 when Jonathan Harper was lynched. He found affidavits, burned letters, and one surviving witness, an old freedman named Samuel who worked as a gravedigger. Samuel refused to speak at first, his eyes darting toward the woods even in daylight. But when Henry swore that he wanted to end the killings, the old man leaned forward and whispered, "You can't end what was never buried right." Samuel told him how he'd watched from the trees that night, how Harper's wife had fought harder than any woman he'd ever seen. She'd been dragged, beaten, left for dead beside the same tree where her husband swung. He buried Harper himself, though the Klan had forbidden it. When he went back for the wife's body the next morning, she was gone. Only her bloody shawl remained. He thought she'd died crawling into the river, until the killing started 3 years later. "Some spirits," Samuel said, "they don't cross over. They walk till the balance is right." Henry left the meeting shaken. It was one thing to chase a murderer, another to chase vengeance dressed as a woman. The deeper he looked, the more he felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. The town wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by guilt. He noticed that every man who'd been killed had been part of the same secret meeting, the one that ordered Jonathan Harper's execution. 11 men in total. 9 were dead. 2 were still breathing. And both were prominent: Reverend Alcott, the town's preacher, and Sheriff Crow himself. The revelation gnawed at him. Crow had known all along. That's why he'd been so quiet, so haunted. The sheriff was not just chasing the widow, he was hiding from her. Henry wanted to confront him, but the man's face already gave away the truth. The tremor in his hand when he poured whiskey. The way he flinched at footsteps outside his door. The sheriff wasn't preparing to hunt. He was waiting to die. Evelyn Harper had grown skilled in waiting. The years had stripped her of softness but sharpened her patience into a blade. Her appearance had changed. She now moved through towns as a nurse, a teacher, even a widow seeking charity. Each disguise brought her closer to her targets. She could listen to their voices, share their supper, and vanish before dawn. Every kill was another stitch in her quiet tapestry of revenge. She didn't strike blindly. She studied each man's habits, his sins, his fears. She wanted them to understand, not just die. Reverend Alcott was next. He'd been the one who blessed the rope used on her husband. She remembered his voice, steady and self-righteous, preaching that the Lord cleanses sin with fire. She found him in his church alone at night, polishing the altar cross. He looked up when the door creaked, startled but unafraid. He thought she was another parishioner. She walked closer, her face hidden by a black veil. "You blessed a rope once," she whispered. "Do you remember?" His eyes widened, mouth trembling as he stammered scripture. She placed the ring on the altar between them. "You told them God forgives." I don't. When they found him the next morning, the church doors were locked from the inside. The candles still burned. His body lay beneath the cross, his tongue cut out, and a single gold ring pressed into his palm. On the wall behind him, written in ash, were the initials JH+E. The town panicked. Even the bravest men began to flee south. Rumors spread that she could be anyone, a widow, a traveler, a ghost. But Sheriff Crow knew better. He knew she was real, and he knew she was coming for him. The night before Christmas, he sat alone in his home, staring at the fire, revolver on the table, ring in his pocket. He'd once believed that justice was something men could hold in their hands, something enforceable. But this was something older, something that made the law look small. At midnight, a knock echoed through the house. Soft, deliberate. He stood, heart hammering, and called out. No answer. When he opened the door, cold air rushed in. And there she was. She wasn't the phantom he'd imagined. Her face was pale but human, her eyes hollow but alive. You knew they'd kill him, she said softly. And you wrote it down like it was nothing. He raised the gun, but his hand wouldn't steady. Evelyn, he whispered. She smiled faintly. You remember. What happened next, no one could say for certain. The neighbors heard one shot, then silence. When Henry arrived at dawn, the house was empty, except for a single chair by the fire and a ring resting on the table beside Crow's badge. The sheriff's body was never found. Some said she dragged him to the river. Others said he walked there willingly. The water was calm that morning, the mist thick enough to hide anything. Henry never reopened the case. He left the badge where it was and burned the file himself. The killings stopped after that. But some nights when the fog rolled in from the river, the townsfolk swore they could still hear humming, soft, mournful, and unending. Spring of 1873 came quietly to Georgia, but the air carried something uneasy beneath the warmth. Americus had become a hollow shell of itself, a town haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. The people avoided mirrors, avoided the river, avoided one another. The church stood empty, its windows blackened by soot. Sheriff Crow's office had been shuttered, the badge left to tarnish on his desk. Henry Lowe was the only man left still trying to believe in order, though his belief had worn thin. Each dawn he would walk along the riverbank with his lantern, tracing the fog for any sign of the sheriff's body. But the water had swallowed its secret whole. For weeks the town whispered of quiet footsteps after dark, of soft humming that drifted through open windows, of a figure seen near the old cemetery gates. Henry told himself it was grief playing tricks. Yet something inside him began to unravel, a feeling that Evelyn Harper's vengeance had not ended, only paused. He thought of the 11 names. 10 were gone, 1 remained, and though he hadn't spoken it aloud, he knew who it was. The final name on her list was his own. He had never raised a hand against Jonathan Harper. He was too young then, still cleaning rifles and fetching water for men he didn't dare question. But Evelyn didn't distinguish between hands in silence. She had watched him that night, standing among the men as the rope was tightened, his face pale, his lips trembling but voiceless. Silence in her eyes was complicity. He had lived because he looked away. Now that debt was due. Henry began leaving his lamp lit through the night, though he could no longer sleep. Each sound, with the creak of wood, the whistle of wind, made his chest tighten. He found himself reading the sheriff's old notes, searching for meaning, for a pattern that could make this feel like something other than a haunting. But the notes offered no salvation. Each line was a confession disguised as evidence. We knew. We all knew. One afternoon, Henry rode to the Harper property, long abandoned and overgrown. The house was half collapsed, the roof caved in, but the front steps still stood, covered in vines. He walked slowly, as if trespassing on sacred ground. The smell of damp wood and earth filled his lungs. He found a rusted lantern, a child's shoe, and, tucked inside a rotted drawer, a photograph. The image was faded, but clear enough. Evelyn standing beside Jonathan, both smiling faintly beneath a magnolia tree. The same ring gleamed on her finger. He stared at it until the sun began to fall. When he turned back toward his horse, he saw something carved into the wood near the doorframe. You watched. The letters were uneven, carved by hand, and old enough to be nearly swallowed by moss. That night, Henry dreamed of the rope. He saw Jonathan's face, calm, unblinking, and Evelyn's scream echoing through the trees. He woke drenched in sweat, the faint sound of humming fading into silence. When he lit the lamp, he found the photograph lying on his desk. He had left it in the drawer at the ruins. His hand shook as he held it. The next morning, he packed his things. There was nowhere left to run, but leaving felt like motion, and motion felt like survival. He saddled his horse before dawn, the mist still thick, and headed north along the river. But before he reached the bridge, he saw her. She was standing in the shallows, barefoot, the hem of her black dress darkened by the water. She didn't move. The fog coiled around her like smoke. For a long moment he thought she was an apparition, until she spoke. "You were there," she said softly. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of years. "You didn't stop them." Henry couldn't find his words. His throat felt like it was closing. "I was just a boy," he finally managed. "I didn't know what they'd do." She stepped closer, the river rippling around her ankles. "You watched," she said again. "That's all it takes." He wanted to plead, to beg forgiveness, but the look in her eyes silenced him. There was no fury there anymore, only exhaustion, the kind that lives after vengeance has burned everything else away. She looked older now, her face pale but steady. "I've finished," she whispered. "There's no one left." She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the fog met the sun. "But I can't rest." "Not yet." Henry took a step forward. "Then what do you want?" She looked at him, and for the first time he saw tears. Not of sorrow, but of release. "Someone to remember," she said. "Someone who won't let them tell it wrong." He nodded, unsure what that meant, but feeling the truth in it. She turned and walked deeper into the water. The mist swallowed her whole. Henry shouted, but she didn't look back. When the fog lifted, there was nothing. No ripples, no footprints, no trace. Only her veil, caught on a branch near the bank, glistening with dew. He carried that veil back to town and placed it in the sheriff's drawer beside the ring. He sealed them both in a small box, locked it, and buried it beneath the magnolia tree at the Harper home. On the box, he carved the words she'd spoken. Remember. Years passed, and the story became folklore. A ghost tale told to children who didn't believe in justice or monsters anymore. They called her the Black Widow, a spirit who haunted wicked men. But the truth was quieter than legend. She hadn't wanted to haunt. She had only wanted the world to know what silence costs. Henry lived to old age, his hair silver, his hands trembling when he wrote. Before he died, he left a single letter addressed to whoever still cares to read. It was dated August 1899, the ink faded but legible. "I was there," it began. "I saw the cruelty we justified. I saw a woman lose everything and rise from the ashes we left her in. The men she killed were not innocent, but neither were the rest of us. Justice is not the same as peace. She taught me that." He ended the letter with a final line, underlined twice. "If you stand by and do nothing, the river remembers your face too." When they found his body, he was sitting by the river, the same lantern burning beside him, though no one had lit it. Some say the flame burned for 3 nights without going out. Others claim they saw a figure in black standing across the water, her veil drifting with the wind, watching over him. In Americus, the story was never written in the records. The deaths remained unsolved, the names quietly erased. But every spring, when the fog rolls in and the river swells, flowers appear on the old magnolia roots. No one knows who leaves them. The petals are always white, but by morning the edges turn crimson, as if the tree itself remembers the blood it once witnessed. And sometimes, on nights when the wind is still, the faint hum of a woman's voice carries across the water, slow, mournful, and full of something no man can quite name. The veil of time never truly settled over Americus. Even as decades passed and telegraph poles replaced torches, there remained a restlessness in the soil, a quiet reminder that justice had never been born there, only vengeance. By the 1920s, the town had remade itself into something almost respectable. The train station bustled. The courthouse had been rebuilt in brick and marble, but the river still wound through its edge like a scar. Locals said the fog there didn't rise naturally. It climbed, as if something buried beneath still needed to breathe. A new generation had grown up, hearing whispers about the widow of the river. They dismissed her as folklore, a southern ghost meant to scare drunk men and curious children. Teachers said it was superstition. Preachers said it was sin. But the elders still locked their doors at dusk, and none dared walk alone near the old Harper property. Something lingered in the air there, the faint metallic tang of iron, like blood left too long in water. In the summer of 1921, a historian named Dr. Wallace Burke arrived from Savannah. He was researching post-war vigilante movements and wanted to understand how myth could become history. He carried a notebook full of dates, names, and rumors, and one question that had followed him since graduate school. Why did so many records from Americus vanish between 1870 and 1873? The courthouse logs jumped from March to December with entire months missing. Even the church's registry had been torn. It was as though the town had chosen collective amnesia. But history, Burke believed, always leaves fingerprints. He rented a small room above the general store and spent his days interviewing the old-timers who still remembered the river before the bridge. Most refused to speak. A few hinted at things they'd heard from their fathers, about a woman who took justice into her own hands. Burke noted every detail. He cross-referenced names, Harper, Crow, Alcott, Lowe, and traced them through what few documents remained. The deeper he went, the more the gaps between facts felt deliberate. Then, one evening, he found something. In a box labeled MISC, 1870-75 at the county archives, wedged between water-stained ledgers, was a letter sealed in wax. The paper was brittle, the ink brown with age. It bore the initials H.L., Henry Lowe. The date read August 3rd, 1873. Burke's pulse quickened. He read carefully, each word trembling on the edge of revelation. To whoever may one day care to know the truth, I have buried what remains of her story where the magnolias grow wild. Do not disturb it unless you seek to carry the weight yourself. Justice was done, but not peace. I write this so her name will not vanish, even if her face must. No signature, no address. Just the faint imprint of something pressed into the corner. A small ring-shaped mark. As though a seal had been made not with wax, but with metal. Burke followed the clue to the Harper property, though most of it had long been reclaimed by forest. The magnolia tree still stood, its roots vast and twisted, its blossoms pale and fragrant. He searched around it for hours until he found a patch of earth that looked disturbed, as if the soil had been dug up and replaced long ago. He dug carefully, brushing away roots and rocks until his hand struck wood. A small box, barely the size of a Bible, lay there. He lifted it out with trembling hands. Inside were two objects, a gold ring and a strip of black lace, frayed at the edges but still faintly smelling of lavender. Beneath them was a folded page, its ink faded nearly to invisibility. He held it to the light, straining to read. It was written in a delicate feminine hand. I have seen men justify cruelty with scripture and law. I have seen them hang truth beside the innocent. I have taken from them what they took from me, and it has not filled the hollow they left. If this is justice, then justice is a ghost, and I am its vessel. Burke felt the air shift around him, colder despite the heat. He wasn't a superstitious man, but something about those words made the forest seem suddenly alive, listening. He placed the note back inside and sealed the box again. That night, he dreamt of a woman in black standing by the river. Her face turned away, her voice barely a whisper. Remember me? But tell it right. When he returned to town, he wrote an article for the Georgia Historical Review titled The Widow of Americus, Myth or Manifestation. It detailed the killings, the missing sheriff, the anonymous letter, and the rediscovered box. But before it went to print, the editor received an anonymous warning. Some truths were buried for a reason. Let them rest. The article was never published. The notes vanished from Burke's archive 6 months later. He died in 1924 in a house fire that began, they said, in his study. After that, the story fell silent again, at least officially. Yet every 20 or 30 years someone new would come asking. In 1951, a journalist from Atlanta claimed to have seen the same ring in a pawn shop window. In 1976, a university student filming a local history project recorded what sounded like humming near the riverbank, though no one else was there. The tape cut to static. In 1993, a construction crew widening the bridge unearthed fragments of an old wooden box, empty but marked with faint letters, JH+E. The workers refused to continue the next day. By the time the 21st century arrived, the widow had become a local legend again, a story told at Halloween, stripped of its tragedy, turned into spectacle. But one archivist in Atlanta, a woman named Celeste Moore, wasn't satisfied with legend. She was cataloging forgotten letters from Reconstruction when she stumbled across Burke's correspondence. One envelope, undated, contained a photograph, a magnolia tree, and a headstone beside it. The stone was carved with a single word: Evelyn. No last name, no date. Just that. Celeste drove to Americus one spring morning, guided by the image. The property was now fenced, marked private. She climbed over anyway. The magnolia still bloomed, its scent heavy in the air. The headstone was there, half hidden under ivy, exactly as in the photo. But something else had changed. Someone had placed a fresh ring of white flowers around it. Lilies, still damp with morning dew. No one in town admitted to doing it. She stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the trees. Then she noticed something strange. The faint sound of humming, low and rhythmic, coming from the direction of the river. She turned, half expecting to see another visitor. The bank was empty. Only the fog moved, curling like breath. She whispered, "Evelyn?" The humming stopped. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then a single magnolia blossom fell from the tree and landed at her feet. Its edges, once white, darkened slowly to crimson. Celeste knelt and picked it up. The scent of lavender lingered in the air. When she returned home, she began writing her paper, determined to restore the widow's story, not as myth, but as testimony. She titled it simply, "The Woman Who Would Not Stay Silent." But before submission, she found her laptop screen flickering. One sentence repeatedly appearing in her notes as if typed by unseen hands. You watched. The cursor blinked. The sentence erased itself. Outside, the wind howled faintly through the night, and somewhere in the distance, beneath the noise of the storm, there came the soft, haunting hum of a woman's voice. The firelight flickered across her face as she sat alone by the river that night, the air thick with humidity and the stench of blood and swamp rot. The moon was high, silver and cruel, glinting off the blade she cleaned with steady hands. 11 names, 11 men, all gone. But the 12th, he was still out there. The one who had given the order. The one who watched her family burn and called it justice. Pause. They called her the Black Widow because no one who shared her bed lived to see another sunrise. But to her, it was never about seduction, it was about balance. Each kill, each whisper in the dark, each body found in the marsh was a piece of the scales tipping back toward what had been stolen. She didn't hunt for pleasure. She hunted to restore the silence of the dead. Rumors spread faster than the fire she left behind. In taverns and churchyards, in whispers passed from soldier to sheriff, they said she could melt into the night itself. Some claimed she was a witch, others a demon wearing the skin of a woman. Men of the clan began sleeping with loaded pistols, jumping at shadows. Wives wept as their husbands disappeared one by one, throats slit or found hanging in their own barns. Yet when the law searched, there were no footprints, no fingerprints, only the faint scent of magnolia and gunpowder. SFX, slow-dripping water, distant thunder. In 1872, a letter arrived at the desk of Sheriff Albright in Mississippi. It was unsigned, sealed with a drop of black wax. Inside, in elegant cursive, it read, "You took my brother. You took my name. I am coming for yours." The sheriff dismissed it as a prank until his deputy was found in the bayou, his body twisted, a strand of black lace tied around his wrist. From that night, the killings followed a pattern, each man connected by a secret oath, each one present on the night of the Barlow Massacre. The massacre no one talked about anymore. The night a freed family was burned alive in their cabin, accused of harboring a runaway. The same night a young girl vanished into the forest, her face never seen again. Music, low cello drone. Years later, they said she'd learned her methods from the Union camps, how to poison without trace, how to turn charm into weaponry, how to make a man confess his sins while believing he was being saved. The Black Widow didn't just kill. She made them face what they'd done. Witnesses, those few who survived her, spoke of her calmness. One man, trembling in his confession, said, "She looked at me like she could see through bone. She said my sins smelled like smoke." He hung himself 3 days later. By autumn, fear had hollowed the town. White hoods no longer paraded under torchlight. Instead, they stayed behind locked doors, whispering prayers to a God who suddenly felt too far away. The widow had done what no army could. She had made terror change sides. Her vengeance became legend, her presence myth. But the closer she came to her final target, the less she slept. The nightmares returned, the screams of her mother, the sound of her brother's voice calling her name through the fire. She had built her identity on their ashes, but the truth, her truth, was starting to break through the mask she'd worn too long. In a decaying plantation house outside Vicksburg, she found him. The last name on her list, Thomas Keene, Grand Dragon of the Klan, the man whose signature authorized the massacre. He was older now, weaker, his hair gone gray but his eyes still venomous. She entered his house as a nurse, pretending to care for his failing heart. For 3 weeks, she watched him breathe, fed him medicine she prepared herself, and listened to his drunken mutterings about the girl who ran. He didn't recognize her. Not yet. Pause once. But he would. One stormy evening, as thunder rolled across the fields, she poured him a final glass of whiskey. He drank it without suspicion, coughing as it burned his throat. Then she whispered his name, the way her mother had the night before she died. He froze, eyes widening. "Do you remember the Barlow cabin?" she asked softly. His breath caught. His hands began to shake. He saw it then, the girl's eyes in her face, the fire reflected in her calm. You should be dead," he rasped. "You should have stayed buried." She leaned close enough for him to smell the magnolia oil on her skin. "So should you." What happened next was never recorded in any police file. When the sheriff arrived days later, Keene was found sitting in his chair by the fire, eyes open, his face twisted in a silent scream. The room smelled of iron and perfume. On the table beside him lay a single black ribbon, soaked in whiskey and blood. After that night, the murders stopped. The town tried to forget, to bury her story under layers of time and denial. Preachers called her a devil, while the freedmen called her an avenger. But no one knew where she went. Some say she boarded a train heading north, carrying a single trunk and a locket engraved with 11 tiny crosses. Others say she never left, that she melted back into the swamps, watching from the shadows, waiting for her country to learn what justice truly meant. Years later, in 1911, workers demolishing an old chapel found a hidden room beneath the floorboards. Inside were 13 glass jars, each containing a slip of parchment with a name. 11 of those names matched the men she'd killed. The 12th was Thomas Keene. The 13th was blank. Pause 0.8s. Some believe it was her own. Even now, local legends speak of her ghost walking the riverbanks when the air smells of rain and fire. They say if you follow the sound of her humming, you'll find a black ribbon tied to a tree, swaying like a warning. Historians tried to dismiss her as folklore, a fever dream of Reconstruction rage, but every so often, an old diary, a letter, or a death certificate surfaces, aligning perfectly with the names she left behind. 11 deaths that couldn't be explained by time or chance. 11 men who vanished into history, their families too afraid to speak their names aloud. Her story isn't about revenge anymore. It's about memory. About what happens when a nation tries to silence its sins and the ghosts refuse to rest. She became what they feared most, a black woman who turned their own violence into retribution. And though her name has been erased from every record, her legend lingers, proof that justice, once awakened, doesn't die quietly. SFX. Wind through trees. Distant river current. Music fades to a slow, haunting violin. Whisper. They took everything from me. I just returned the favor. Pause 1.5s. The story of the Black Widow isn't one of madness, it's one of balance. Because in 1872, in the dark heart of the South, she didn't just kill men. She killed an idea and left the rest of America to live with what it had created. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've already felt it, that quiet unease crawling beneath the surface of history. The truth isn't buried in archives or sealed in courtrooms. It's breathing, just beneath the skin of every forgotten name and every unmarked grave. The Black Widow's story isn't just about vengeance. It's about what happens when silence becomes unbearable. And justice decides to speak back. Pause 0.5s. If this story made you question what you've been told. If it made you feel something, anger, grief, awe, then this channel is where those feelings belong. Every week we uncover the hidden, the forbidden, and the erased. We bring back the voices that history tried to smother and let them tell their truth in the dark. So before you go, lower tone, take a moment. Subscribe, not for the algorithm, but for the ghosts still waiting to be heard. Comment below what you felt when you realized who she truly was. Tell me whether you think her vengeance was justice or madness, because history doesn't live in textbooks. It lives in conversations like this. And every time you listen, comment, or share, you're helping another lost story find its way home. Soft fade. Remember, truth doesn't rot, it waits. And if this story found you tonight, maybe it was because something or someone wanted you to remember. Whisper, subscribe, and keep the lights low for the next one.